Spirit 92.9 welcomes you to The Lunch Break with your friends Josh, Jess, and Rachel. Join us as we chat about life, food, faith, and everything in between.
Welcome back to The Lunch Break Podcast. We're Josh and Jess and Rachel from Spirit 92.9. This is episode 2 in season 2, and today we're going to be talking all about the faithfulness of God. It is definitely what carries us through, and we're going to just share some stories about God's faithfulness in our own lives, and also hopefully you will feel encouraged and remember his faithfulness in your own life as well.
That's
Glad
right.
you're here.
Woo! So let's get started by what did we bring in our lunch boxes today? Do you want me to start?
Or crock pots,
Or crock pots, yeah. The entire
Yes.
station has smelled amazing yet again because Josh brought his crock pot today.
I did.
So, okay, tell us what's in the crock pot today, Josh.
Yeah. So, and by the way, this podcast is called the Lunch Break Podcast because we discovered we have some of the best conversations around the table when we have
Yes.
lunches together here. And so we thought it would be fun to incorporate that into this podcast. So we try to bring a lunch when we record episodes. And today, as I often do, I used my crock pot. A lot of that is because it's just very easy and I kind of forget till the last minute that I need to make something for the next day. So today I brought pulled pork. I got a nice pork roast. And I threw that in my crock pot last night. And this is the Dr. Pepper version. So I poured some Dr. Pepper in
What?
there, put
Yeah.
a few spices on
So
it.
good.
And now I've got pulled pork in there. And everybody's been commenting about how good this building smells today. And
Yeah.
Some
got
of us might have snuck some.
Yeah, and that's fine. I've
Did
got
you
so
have
much.
some of Josh's lunch today, Jess?
I did. I had a little bowl of it before we started.
That is just fine. There's plenty for everyone. I've also got some of those Hawaiian sweet rolls
Oh,
in
yum.
there, and I really like dill pickle chips with pulled pork, so I got some of those as well, some barbecue sauce. So it's very easy, and it's quite tasty.
It is an easy dinner. I've made it before too. Like you can just throw a few things in there and then everybody loves it.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, Rachel, now it's your turn.
It's my turn. Okay. Well, I'm going to let Josh say what he always says when I talk about my lunch first.
Well, I usually say it's fancy. Is it
Yeah.
fancy again today?
Well, I guess it might be fancy again today. So I made Parmesan crusted salmon with pesto pasta.
so fancy!
Wow.
So, yeah, so it's basically like, breadcrumbs and Parmesan on top of salmon. And then the pasta is super easy. You just boil it and then take a jar of pasta and put that in there. So I consider this easy fancy.
Can we talk about, though, the rule about not heating up fish in the work microwave? Because are you going to do that today?
Uh-oh.
Maybe.
Uh-oh. You know, it's
Sorry.
okay because the smell of the pulled pork will
See,
just
it's going to balance out.
cover everything.
Maybe.
Thank you, Jesus, for pulled pork.
Sorry. Anyways, Jess, what did you bring today?
So it is September right now. And so to me, that is the start of comfort food season.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I love to make in my Instant Pot, not my crock pot,
Ooh, ouch.
is beef stew. It's another thing that you just throw everything in there. It's so super simple. And so that is definitely on the menu. I'm so excited, and it's simple and good. And we're going to share the recipes for all of these on Spirit 92.9. If you click on the Lunch Break Podcast, there's a recipe box there. We always share our recipes so you can get some ideas for your family too.
Cool.
That's right. So we're talking about God's faithfulness today. And Jess, before we started, said, should we just have a little impromptu worship session and sing Great is Thy Faithfulness?
And then I said, no, because you two can sing and I can't. So I'll just be howling in the background and ruin the whole thing. But
Yeah.
maybe you two could. I don't know.
Oh, who knows? We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But while we were talking about this topic, I was also thinking of goodness of God. There are so many songs that talk about God's faithfulness. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good. So as we talk about God's faithfulness, Josh, what comes to mind for you?
I mean, songs like
Yeah.
that always come to mind. Great is Thy Faithfulness. Of course, one of the most well-loved hymns of all time. Do It Again by Elevation Worship. I've resonated with that song. I think God's faithfulness is something that has resonated with me for quite a long time. It's such a cool thing that even when we go through our struggles of life and we walk away sometimes, like God is still faithful to us through all of that. He doesn't change. He doesn't change his stance towards us. He doesn't change his love towards us. It just stays the same. And that's something that is a little hard to understand from our perspective, because we've seen people come and go in our lives, and we've seen conditional love, and we've seen unfaithfulness, and yet God's love is faithful and it doesn't change.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. Like, I think of the word consistency. When so often in our world, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, things are constantly changing. Everything around us is changing. People are changing. Society is changing. But God never changes. He is always consistent. He's always the same. And he's always faithful. He will never stop being faithful to us. He's just always unwavering.
Yeah. Hebrews, I think it's 13:5 comes to mind too. The I will never leave you or forsake you verse, because people in my own experience have not been faithful. But God will never walk away. And he says that, and he means that. And I'll be the one to challenge this a little bit, because I have been the doubter, where I've listened to the words, all my life you have been faithful. All my life you've been so good. And I've been like, has he though? Because I've gone through some really hard stuff. But here's the thing. When I look back on those times and I look back on those circumstances now that I'm through them and the pain isn't so deep, I can see his faithfulness through those times. So sometimes when you're in the middle of those things, you don't feel like he's being faithful. You feel like he's left you or forsaken you, but you can look back later and you can see how he was such a part of that story, and he never did leave you, and he helped you through it. And so, if you're in the middle of that right now, just hang in there, because that time will come where you look back and you see his faithfulness.
Yeah, Jess, I can relate to that, because there are times for me, for sure, that I have questioned that and been like, God, where are you? Where are you? I needed you to come through for me, and there have been times that I felt like he hasn't. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't, but there are times that I think we definitely feel like that. And that's where it's so important, and I know we're going to be talking about this today, to remind ourselves of how he has been faithful in the past. And so many stories in the Bible, they're reminding themselves of God's faithfulness in the past. They crossed through the Red Sea, that story of Moses and the Israelites crossing through the Red Sea. Well, they had Passover every year and reminded themselves of how God delivered them out of slavery, out of bondage, how they crossed through the Red Sea. They would tell that to their children and their children's children. And they would pass these stories of God's faithfulness down through the generations. And that's kind of what we need to do as well. Not only the biblical stories, but our own stories of how God has been faithful, to remind ourselves and others that, yes, he did it once, he's going to do it again.
Absolutely. And I think we all can struggle with that. As you guys were talking, I was thinking of specific times where I would call it that messy middle, where you're in the middle of something that's really hard in your life, and you do ask that question of God, where are you? What is going on? How am I supposed to move forward? And it's true. In those moments when I have taken a minute to say, okay, God, you have brought me this far. You brought me through this situation. You brought me through this. You're going to do it again. You're going to bring me through. And that can be so hard to, when you're in the middle of that mess, to acknowledge and say, yes, God, you have brought me through it. And that's a huge part of our faith. We have to rely on him and only him. And it's hard, but it's really, really, really worth it.
Yeah. And that's the thing with, the older you get and the more trials that you go through, it's a faith builder, because you see his faithfulness again and again and again. And we don't want to go through that stuff, right? We want to pray those struggles away. We want to ask God to take those trials from us and just make everything all better again. But those are the times in our lives when he really works the most and our faith is built the most, and he shows us his faithfulness. It's like, when you're married, the longer you're married and the longer that there's faithfulness there, you learn to trust that your spouse is going to remain faithful to you, right? It's the same in our relationship with God. The more that we go through, the more opportunity he has to show that faithfulness to us. That builds our faith, and then we can share that with others to build their faith as well. So it's hard when we go through those things. I mean, I have been betrayed in marriage and in friendships, and I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone else, but at the same time, I look at how my faith grew and my trust in God through those things. And now on the other side, even though wouldn't want to go through them again, I'm thankful for what God taught me in those seasons. And so the more you go through things, the more you learn about his faithfulness.
Yeah. Well, and can I just share a story of God's faithfulness that my dad shared with me, and this was encouraging to me because it's kind of like what we were talking about, writing down those stories, remembering those stories, and then telling them to your kids and your kids' kids. So when my dad was in his young 20s, he and my mom had been married for a few years, and they had 3 boys. I was the third one, and my dad's a pastor. And they were really struggling to make ends meet. It was just very, very tight. And my dad at one point wrote out a check to the church for like his tithe check. And he realized, okay, when this is deposited, there's going to be a negative balance in my bank account. Like, here they are trying to provide for 3 little boys, and he's trying to fulfill God's call in his life, being a pastor in this small town in Northwest Wisconsin. And it's like, wow, I don't know what all emotions my parents were experiencing at that point, but there had to be some nervousness and maybe even feeling like failures, like, wow, we're struggling just to provide for our family. And my dad told me one specific detail. He's like, we couldn't even afford something like Oreos at that point. Well, so it was shortly thereafter, after he'd written that check. It was like a Sunday afternoon, and a station wagon. You remember those station wagons?
Yeah.
Pulled into my parents' driveway, and this guy gets out, and he's from my grandpa's church, and he comes and knocks on the door. And he says, hey, so our church has decided that you guys are our missionary of the month. And he starts unloading all these groceries from the back of this station wagon. My dad said there were even Oreos in there. And he's like, so their church had a bunch of them had bought groceries, and they didn't know what my parents were going through, but they sent all these groceries over. And then he's like, oh, and some of the people, they didn't really want to buy groceries, so they just gave cash. So here's some cash as well.
Goodness.
And so it was just, in this moment where it felt like maybe God is not going to be faithful. He was faithful. He provided. He provided for my dad and my mom and my family. And my dad was like, yeah, as soon as that station wagon pulled back out of the driveway, we were on our knees thanking God. And it's such a cool story. And it's one that is going to stick with me for a long time. And it's one that if I ever have kids, I'm going to tell them about that too. And it's one of those things you can write down and just continue to pass on. Hey, God is faithful, and he's going to provide.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And think about the impact that story has had on you, and your trust in God. And, you get to share that. And that's why I think, too, like you said, telling those stories to our children, even if it's the little things, I'll do that. Like if, maybe I don't know if God shows favor like with parking spots, but if I'm like, God, give us a parking spot, and then one opens, I'll be like, ooh, thank you, God.
Yes,
Daddy,
so
thank
real.
you, God. Just the little things, like try to always give him the credit when he answers prayer, when he does provide, and then sometimes we got to write those things down too. Like I want to be better about this. I try to do it sometimes, but journaling those circumstances so that when you're in a time of doubt or a season of doubt, or you're wondering why God is silent, you can go back and you can read about those and be reminded of his faithfulness so that you can trust him going forward.
Yeah.
Love that story.
Yeah, because, we forget so easily, right?
It's true.
I think we read the stories in the Bible sometimes, and we see, that one with the Israelites that came out of Egypt that I mentioned earlier. And it's like, wow, they saw God bring them out of Egypt and do all these miraculous signs and wonders and literally part a sea so they could walk through on dry ground. And then it's like they get out in the desert and they're like, God, where are you?
Yeah.
Why aren't you providing for us? We want to go back to Egypt. And we read those stories and we're like, ugh, they are so dumb. How could they do that? And yet I do the same things, like I've seen God be faithful in my life, and yet I still doubt him. And so that, to your point, Jess, is exactly why we need to remember those things and write them down. Because if we don't, sometimes our default is doubting. And so we got to remember.
Yeah. Now that we're talking about stories, do you mind if I share a story?
No, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so this was when I was living in Florida. I had been there for a year and a half at this point. Maybe, actually, no, it was actually exactly a year. Because my rent was ending for this place that I was living at. And I was just ready to move on to something else. But the town that I was living in Florida, I'm talking super small. Like if you're looking for a place to rent, it's all by word of mouth. It's all by who you know. There's not big apartment complexes or anything like that. And so I had realized that I had wanted to move, and I had 2 weeks to figure out where was my next place that I was going to live. Where was it going to be?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. And so I was asking everyone in my life. I was like, do you know of anyone who has a place that's, they're renting? Anything like that. And so I was so desperate at that point. I was asking the people that I dog sit for if they knew of anyone that had a place that was available for rent. And so I had just been praying very specific prayers of like, God, please just give me a place that's like in my price range, everything that I need. At the end of that first week, one of the couples that I dog sit for got back in contact with me and said, there's a house that's for rent right down the street. They have been waiting for someone to be recommended to them, and we recommended you. So you're in. And so it literally was like the end of that week, signed the contract, everything. Then the next week moved in, and it was all done. It was literally like, thinking back on that, at that time I was going through all of those doubts of, God, you brought me here for a reason, but this is really, really hard and I don't know what I'm going to do. You go through all of those different thoughts when you're in the middle of it. Yeah. But then now looking back and saying, wow, God, that I couldn't have done that myself. You moved all of the puzzle pieces into, the perfect picture that I needed it to be. And yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. Isn't it? I love God and how he sometimes tests our trust, and his faithfulness comes through, but it's not in the way we think, and it's not in our timing. And I think of things like that. He does that, I assume, to remind us that our trust needs to be in him and that he is our provider. Because, we do that around here at the radio station even. We're financially supported by advertisers, but also by donations. And sometimes we'll get kind of to the end of the year and we'll start going, okay, what do we need to do? We got to do something here to make sure that we meet our goals financially and whatever. And I don't know how many times he's done this, that he comes through for us at the last minute and provides and blows us away. And we're like, oh yeah, sorry. We were trying to make this happen in our own power. Yeah. And then we always need this reminder almost every year from you that you are faithful and you will take care of us and you will finish what you've started here, right? Because this is yours, not ours. And he does that in our lives too. Like he does that with me a lot. And I guess I haven't learned whatever he's trying to teach me yet, because it feels like I'll get all worried about something and all worked up, and then I'll try to figure it out in my own power. And then he'll come through in a way that only he can get the glory for. And it's a reminder to me that God is faithful, and I need to trust that way back at the beginning before I start freaking out and try to have control of the situation. Yeah.
The word control, as soon as you said that, as someone who struggles with control, it can be really hard to trust in God's faithfulness. He's like, oh, well, I'll handle it. I'll take care of it myself. I'll do it. It's no problem. I'll just freak out about it later, but it's fine. But that's literally, I struggle with that a lot, of thinking that I can do it in my own power when, as you were saying, how the station is God's, so is our life. Like all of our lives are God's. And so when we say, I'm giving everything over to you, God, that's surrender. That's trusting in his faithfulness. And it's hard when you struggle with control, but he can take care of it way better than we can.
Isn't that the truth? And he'll use all those situations to continue to teach us, and how he has patience with us as he waits for us to get it and for that to click. I don't know, but I'm just thankful that every time he's so graceful and loving that he's like, okay, here I am again, reminding you this is not for you to worry about. I'm here to take care of you. Calm down. He's just the most loving father in that way.
That's true.
Well, are we ready for some questions from the lunchbox?
Yes,
we are.
So this is what we do every time we record a podcast. I have a lunchbox that looks like a boombox. If you're watching on YouTube right now, you can see this. I'm showing it to the camera. The boombox lunchbox is Very cool. But we draw questions out of this on the topic of the day, which of course is God's faithfulness.
Drum roll.
So let's go with this one. What is a recent answered prayer in your life or a friend's life that sticks out to you? And this is, again, right along that topic of stories of God's faithfulness or stories of God's answered prayer. Any that come to mind?
You guys have
Jess?
shared stories. I just had something happen yesterday, and so I'll just share about that because I shared it on social media. My little 7-year-old Addie, God used a situation in her life to teach her about his faithfulness, but also her mom. She was not excited to go back to school for a few reasons, but one of those reasons was because there's a girl in her class that Addie described as a bully and said that she would bully her a lot and make fun of her and tell her she was ugly. And, you know, as a mom, that just breaks your heart because she's 7, you know, and you want her to believe all the good things about herself. But so what I decided to do, in addition to talking with her about treating others with kindness, even when they don't treat us with kindness, because that's what God wants us to do, is we started praying together for this other little girl. And, you know, we don't know the circumstances in her life or why she feels the need to be mean, but we just asked God if he would change her heart and if they could become friends and to help Addie to be kind to her, even if she wasn't nice to Addie. And but Addie just kept bringing it up. Every time somebody would say, "Are you excited to go back to school?" she'd say, "No, because I don't want to see this little girl's name," you know. And so I was like, well, God, we're just going to put this in your hands and trust you with it. And so she started school yesterday when we're recording this. And when I picked her up yesterday from school, she was just in such a great mood. She had a great day at school, which I was so happy about. And then she was so excited to tell me that this little girl who had been bullying her was nice to her today, that she had apologized for being mean and calling her ugly, and that she asked if they could be friends. And so now they're best friends, Addie said, which everybody's Addie's best friend, but that's okay.
That's awesome.
But, you know, and I hope that continues, you know, but I hope that Addie saw that our prayers for her, that God answered that and he worked in that little girl's heart like we asked, and that he worked in Addie's heart and she was able to be kind and not, you know, start anything before that happened. And for me as her mom, it's like, wow, what a reminder of how important our prayers are, how God is faithful. And that might not always happen right away, like it did with Addie, right? But he's faithful to us in our prayers, whether it's to change the other person or just to change us, which is equally as important, to change our heart and to continue praying for other people, because God is faithful to work in those situations in his way. And so it was just kind of a cool reminder, a lot about prayer, but also God's faithfulness, that he hears us and that the little things matter to him, right? Like you might think, oh, a little kid at school and a bully, it's a big thing to Addie. And so then it was a big thing to God, and he showed her that, you know? Yeah. So I love it.
Oh, that's so special. Well, should I share a story? Sure. So I have a friend, and she was just really struggling at her job. Just kind of a toxic work environment, not really great. And all of us, our friend group, had been praying for her, like intense prayer for something to open up, for there to be a way for her to get out, you know, something like that. And part of the reason we had been praying that was she just had really been struggling with, you know, because it was, you know, you're working there 5 days a week. When it's a toxic work environment, it affects your mental health. And she was just so down, and she was depressed, and we just knew that something had to change. So we had been praying and praying and praying, and just consistently praying. And that can be hard to keep praying when nothing is happening. But we just said, okay, God, we're going to trust that you can bring her out of this. And so now she is in this new job. She's feeling so much better. Her mental health has become better. And also she had been struggling with like some heart issue things, and her resting heart rate has gone down 12 points with like just going to this new job and everything. Literally huge answer to prayer. And that was a consistent time of praying for maybe 2-3 months. And now to see the change and the way that God has been incredibly faithful to her and her life, it's proof for her and also all of us of, wow, prayer is very powerful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll just share a really quick story about an answered prayer in my life, my family's life. So my dad, as I mentioned earlier, is a pastor, and usually about once a year he goes to Haiti to help train pastors over there. And earlier this year in 2024, he went over there, and things have been kind of volatile in Haiti for a while. But when he got over there, things escalated, and it got so bad. There was gang violence and essentially a civil war happening in Haiti, and it got so bad they closed the airport, and he was trapped in the country. He could not get out. And so we were praying for him, and there were people all over, I dare say all over the world, praying for my dad in this situation. They didn't know how they were going to get out, and they were seeking wisdom and seeking God's help as him and his team were trying to get back to the United States. And long story short, he ended up getting out in a helicopter piloted by a U.S. congressman. It was just a crazy story. Don't have time to share all the details right now, but he was rescued and eventually brought back to the United States. And so that was an answer to prayer right there. My prayer, my family's prayer, and the prayers of a lot of people all over the place.
Yeah, it was like on national news channels and stuff when he got, so cool. Yeah.
Wow.
All right, question number 2 from the lunchbox. I think we got time for at least one more here. So we've talked about this a little bit, but maybe we could give some practical ideas here. How do you keep track of God's faithfulness to you so you don't forget when things get hard again?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to that. Like I had talked about journaling, which is awesome if you remember to do it.
Yeah.
For me, though, honestly, this is a place where I use social media in my life because I try to share those stories on my Facebook page because then they come up in my memories and then I'm like, oh, yeah,
That's smart.
I share it for other people so that they can hear that testimony or read that testimony of his faithfulness, but then also it comes back to me year after year and then I'm reminded. So that's kind of a practical way that I use something that I'm already on. Maybe too much, as opposed to journaling, although I try to do that. This way, I love that it comes back to me year after year. So.
Yeah. That is a really good idea to use social media as kind of like a journal, but like a journal that's also benefiting other people. Because I will say, I love how you do that, Jess. Like the story that you shared about Addie, I saw it and I was like, you have to see that. You have to see how God is working in other people's lives to almost like remind yourself, that can happen for me as well. And I think for me, I am a notes app girl.
Oh, there you go.
I on my notes app in my phone, I'll just jot down like the date or like a way that God is working in my life right now, and maybe even a certain verse that God is using for me in that moment. So yeah, notes app is a thing for me.
Something that comes to mind for me, because I saw it in a movie. There's this movie called Unsung Hero that came out this year. It's about the story of the band For King and Country who came from Australia to the United States, and they were experiencing some pretty extreme poverty at first as they're doing odd jobs and everything just to try to keep afloat. But they had something in the movie that I think they did in real life where they wrote down on Post-it notes prayer requests, and then when that request was answered, they'd take that Post-it note and flip it over on the other side of the wall that said like answered prayers. And so it was just like a practical reminder, and they got their whole family involved. So it's like the mom and dad would write down things, the kids would write down things, and then when it was answered, they'd move it to the other side of the wall. And it was just such a cool visual example of God's faithfulness over time.
Yeah, that's right. That's a powerful scene in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you. What should we do another?
Do we have time for one more?
We do have time for one more.
Let's do one more.
Okay.
One more, just for fun.
One more quick question. How do you trust God even when you're going through a hard season?
I wrote this question down, so I don't want to answer it.
I think it's everything we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
Remembering that he's been faithful before. And looking back on those times and thinking about that, because again, when you're in that hard season, you can't see the way through or the way out. You can't see that God is going to rescue or provide, or you maybe doubt if he will. And so when you're in that messy middle, like you were talking about, Rachel, those are the times when you have to look back and say, God has come through for me so many times. Not always the way I thought, not always in the timing that I hoped, but he did. And here's how he did it. And so if he did it before, I believe he's going to do it again.
Yeah.
Josh was
He'll
talking
do
about
it
that
again.
song. Yeah.
Love that song. And yeah, I would say it takes some intentionality, and that's something that I want to get better at. And it's kind of the theme that's woven through this whole episode, writing those things down, telling other people, and during the good times too, so that when you do go through those hard times, you can go back to that. So intentionality in everything we've just talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, in those hard times, this is kind of a little bit of an admission. Sometimes I will go to other people versus praying first. Ooh, I'm admitting that. But when I do go to other people, I go to my parents. And my parents are the first ones to say, remember when this happened? Remember when that happened in your life? And remember how God worked through this and this and this? So for me, it's having faithful people in your life that are the ones that remind you of God's faithfulness, to say, well, this happened to you before and this has happened to you before, so who says that God can't do it again?
Oh, I love that. And we can do that for other people, point that out to them when they're, stuck in the hard places and remind them how we've seen God work in their lives. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
thank you so much for joining us for Season 2, Episode 2 of the Lunch Break Podcast. And we're going to continue on with Season 2. So thank you so much for listening and watching. You can listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. And you can watch the video version. You can see our faces on the Spirit 92.9 YouTube channel. Make sure that you rate us 5 stars because it helps more people to see the podcast and get it more attention. And again, thank you so much for listening. And you can find the recipes that we talked about earlier on our website, spirit929.com.
And now we're going to go eat them.
Yes. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.